So we have quite a good number of audience. So we'll begin. First of all, a big thank you to Dr. Paul Copan for joining us all the way from the United States. Uh, we'll just a brief introduction about Dr. Paul Copan. He's a very noted name in the field. Dr. Paul is a Christian theologian, analytic philosopher, apologist, and author. He's currently a professor at the Palm Beach Atlantic University, Florida, and has been a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford. He's the author and editor of 45 plus books, including the very popular, strong-selling book, Is God a Moral Monster? He is co-editor of the Routledge Companion to the uh, Philosophy of Religion, the Kalām Cosmological Argument, which is a two-part volume anthology, and many other such books. So we welcome you, Dr. Paul Copan. Thank you for taking out the time to address us. Give me, please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you, Brian, and the Philosophical Society at St. Stephen's College. And I've been to India a few times. I got my Nehru vest in Delhi, where you all are, and I'm glad to be speaking with you. And I wanted to share a few things. I have a significant PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to be able to go through all the slides as slowly as I would like, so I'll have to skip some of them, but I'm happy to make my PowerPoint available to you all, after this discussion. But I wanted to at least let you know that if you feel that this is being rushed and that there's a lot more that I'm skipping that you'd like to slow down on, just know that I'll make this available to you all without any problem at all. So let me just bring up my my PowerPoint, and I'll speak about naturalism. Let me just see here if I can locate where I need to bring this up. I know it's not showing up for me here. Hang on. Let me. Yeah, it's for some reason it's not appearing.
Are you not able to share?
I'm looking at my windows, and I just had been on my. I'm just gonna. Yeah, I just finished clicking off my PowerPoint, and so I thought it'd be readily available here. Let me just click it back on. Sorry about the delay. All right, I'll try that. All right, one more time. Oh, here we go. All right, excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to be speaking on the topic of the naturalness of theism and the unnaturalness of that there are no good reasons to hold to naturalism. And then we want to look at the contours, the worldview contours. What is a worldview? A worldview is simply a philosophy of life. And so we're going to look at which philosophy of life, naturalism or theism, offers to us the best support for its claims. And so we'll see that that God's existence does a significant amount of work in terms of explaining the way things really are, in terms of the way the universe is, and also the way human beings experience life. So we'll look at that. And also, thirdly, I want to note that naturalists themselves actually help support or reinforce belief in God. And that's where I'm going to speed along and pick up the pace. I'm not going to be able to quote all of the naturalists I would like to in support of theism, but that is where we are going to go in this, and then just offer some concluding remarks at the end. So with that, we begin. We'll look at the creeds of naturalism, that its tenets are unsupportable, and we'll look at what theism is first, as the contrast, and then then naturalism itself. And we'll see that there are two initial problems with naturalism: that it is incoherent as well as counterintuitive. So that's where we're going in our first section. So, what are the tenets of theism? And of course, you may be familiar with the BBC, so that will be my means of introducing the tenets of theism. And I would imagine you're all familiar with this basic presentation. But of course, there's a being of maximal greatness. The philosopher Anselm said that God is the being than which nothing greater can be conceived, that God is worship worthy. He's a personal being who's all knowing, all powerful, all present, and so forth. So there is, first of all, a being of maximal greatness. And within the Christian tradition, this being is triune, that there are three persons who share the divine nature or essence. And some people have used the example of Cerberus, the three-headed dog of Greek mythology, where you have one being, one indivisible being, but yet three centers of awareness within that one being. And so we can use that as perhaps an illustration of what we're talking about here. But more generally, we have a being of maximal greatness. And in the biblical tradition, this is not true in the Islamic tradition, but in the biblical tradition, God has made human beings in his image, that we reflect God in certain ways, in limited ways. And say within Islam, this would be an insult to Allah, to make human beings in his image. But this is a remarkable point of connection between us and God, that we are made not only to resemble God, but also to relate to God. And so God bestows on us the divine image. And of course, in the Christian tradition, the divine image in human beings is what makes the incarnation possible, that God becomes human. And so that is how that divine image is like a bridge between God and us. And so Jesus Christ, as the incarnate Son of God, steps into that image, the Word of God becoming flesh and dwelling among us. And also, God, thirdly, here's the C, that God is the creator of all other reality outside of himself. So this is distinct from, say, pantheism. And again, these are pantheism and monism are found within Hinduism. There are there's various versions of that. Pantheism was a view that was maintained by the Hindu philosopher Ramanuja, that there are distinctions within the divine Brahman. So that all things are divine, that are, there are distinct things that are divine. But the previous philosopher, Shankara, maintained monism, that there's only a pure consciousness, Brahman, and that all else, any sort of differentiation, is an illusion. But in the Christian understanding, the biblical understanding, God creates a reality distinct from himself. It is not divine. It is contingent. It depends upon God. And without God, that other reality would not exist. So those are the tenets of theism. And of course, the implications are familiar to you, that the universe began to exist a finite time ago. And I think as we'll see, the beginning of the universe 13.8 billion years ago with the Big Bang fits very nicely within theism. It sounds a lot like Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That a Big Bang needs a Big Banger. And so we have the universe beginning, but the universe is also very bio-friendly, that it is life permitting, but not only life permitting, because that doesn't guarantee that life will be produced. It needs to be life producing as well. And so that is yet another layer of complexity. And then it has to be life sustaining, that you can get a single celled organism, but it can be immediately quashed or crushed, and life is no longer possible. But you have a universe that exists, that is life permitting, that is life producing and life sustaining. And so this fits very nicely within a theistic framework. The creator's personhood, that there is a personal source of the beginning of the universe, a divine will that is behind the universe's beginning. And this is something that speaks to not only personhood in terms of God's own personhood, his will, his ability to execute that will, but also he has bestowed dignity upon us and made human beings to relate to God. That we are not the product of valueless material processes, as the naturalist would maintain, but we have been made with dignity because reality is anchored in a personal creator. Now, what about naturalism? What are the pillars of naturalism? And I'll give you 3 isms here. And again, this is more the strict version of naturalism. We'll talk about that in a moment. But when it comes to metaphysics, which is the study of reality, that's a philosophical discipline. What is really real? And the naturalist maintains that that reality is strictly material, that there is no non-physical aspect of reality unless it is derived directly from the material world. That if you don't have matter, you can't have, say, the mental. The mental is dependent upon the physical, according to some, according to some naturalists. Then there is causation or etiology. How do things work in terms of cause and effect? Well, everything that happens is physically determined by processes going all the way back to the Big Bang. Of course, there remains the question: what caused the Big Bang? And of course, theism has a very ready answer for that, but not the naturalist. But that's so materialism, determinism, and then the third ism is scientism. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. That knowledge is only possible, or at least best possible, through the scientific method. If something cannot be scientifically proven, then it is called into question and is probably meaningless. Again, according to the strict version of naturalism, science is the only way to come to know things. And we'll see that there are problems with this viewpoint. Now, here are a few illustrations of naturalists who will define what they mean. And Kai Nielsen, the late Canadian philosopher, says that naturalism denies that there are any spiritual or supernatural realities. It is the view that anything that exists is ultimately composed of physical components. Then there's determinism. There's no such thing, for example, as free will, that the biological, social, genetic, and environmental, these are the things that cause us to do what we do. That it is not the agent, it is not up to the agent to act, but all these causes that are imposing themselves upon the agent. So there is no genuine freedom or moral responsibility on strict naturalism. And then there's scientism. One naturalist talks about how human beings can be understood in purely physico-chemical terms. That he says that we need to understand, need to look at the world through these physico-chemical considerations in order to understand who we are as human beings. Here's an illustration of this, if you like. Paul and Patricia Churchland, who are naturalistic philosophers of mind. Here is Patricia Churchland after coming home from school and telling her husband to give her a glass of wine because of all of these chemicals and hormones in her body that are making her think and act in a certain way, and so she. So her dopamine levels need lifting, and so pour me a Chardonnay. And so she's speaking in strictly physical, chemical terms, in terms of her own behavior, in terms of her own reactions to the environment around her. And so that's These are very strict naturalists, by the way. There are more broad naturalists, as we'll see, but this is a version of strict naturalism here. Now, what are the implications of naturalism? Well, there's no supernatural, there's no God that exists, no angels, there's no soul, there's no self-determination, there's no free will, there are no signs and wonders, no possibility of the miraculous, there's no survival after death, there's no significance to human beings, there's no solution to the problem of evil. And so these are the very dramatic implications, things that we often take for granted as theists, as believers in God, but these are utterly repudiated by the naturalist. So here's one naturalist, Jaegwon Kim at Brown University, who says that naturalism is imperialistic. It demands full coverage and exacts a terribly high ontological or metaphysical price. In other words, if you're going to be a naturalist, you have to be aware that the consequences are very stark. It is a very drastic worldview that strips away everything about our humanity that we are so familiar with, that we take for granted. And so if you're going to be a naturalist, he says, you need to really take seriously that you are indeed a physico-chemical entity that has no dignity or worth or free will, that you are, that there is no meaning or purpose in life, and so forth. So these are the sorts of things that are radical intrusions upon what we take to be our very humanity. Now, let me just comment on this. First, let me just say that Antony Flew, who is a former naturalist, he became a believer in God late in life. He is at the University of Reading in the UK. And a friend of mine, Gary Habermas, who's done a lot of work on the historicity of Jesus' bodily resurrection, was very close friends with Antony Flew. And when Antony Flew was speaking at my friend's university in Virginia, he was, my friend Gary was telling me this story about a question and answer time, and that Antony Flew was asked by one student, he says, what is your evidence for naturalism? How do you know that naturalism is true? And Antony Flew muddled through a few things, but later confessed to Gary afterwards. He said, here I am, a naturalist, but yet I don't know of any reasons for being a naturalist. So here's the world's leading naturalist philosopher, and he admitted that he didn't have strong or good reasons for being a naturalist. And I think that really becomes clear as well in terms of what we see in our responses to naturalism. First of all, naturalism is incoherent. For one thing, how do we support the three tenets of naturalism? Well, naturalism maintains that matter is all that exists. But how can you show that? How can you prove that? How can you say that there is no such thing as God? This is a deep problem. We can say, yes, we can recognize that the material world exists, but to say that there is nothing more, that is quite a leap to make. And then we have a further problem with the next tenet or pillar of naturalism. When it comes to determinism, how does the naturalist conclude what he does except by forces over which the naturalist has no control? You see, there's no possibility of rational thought if determinism is true. Why should we rationally prefer naturalism over theism if both the naturalist and the theist can't help believing what they do by virtue of forces over which they have no control? And so if the naturalist is correct, then it's strictly by accident. It is not by virtue of any superior rationality. So that's the second problem that there is with naturalism and its incoherence. But the third pillar is also problematic, because it maintains that we can only know through science. But how can you scientifically prove that all knowledge must be scientifically provable? That is a philosophical assumption that cannot be proven by science. And so in the very three major pillars of naturalism, it fails, because you cannot prove or support materialism, because it's possible that God could exist, that determinism can't be shown to be the case, because how do we know that determinism is true since we've only been shaped by forces over which we have no control? So there's no rational basis for this. And then thirdly, scientism. We can't scientifically prove that all knowledge must be scientifically provable. So that's one big problem, the problem of incoherence with all three pillars of naturalism. But it's also counterintuitive, as I said before, that the counterintuitive nature of naturalism is such that it denies what's obvious and fundamental to us as human beings. So we find that if we're going to admit to or embrace naturalism, we're going to have to deny what is so fundamental to our own humanity, and even to things that seem obviously explicable to the theist about the universe around us, how the universe began to exist, how could it be so finely tuned for life, and so on. And here's a helpful distinction, because there are two major types of naturalism. We've been talking about the strict or scientific naturalism, which has been called by Wilfrid Sellars the scientific image. And then there is what's called the manifest image that Wilfrid Sellars talks about. And what is the manifest image, but what seems obvious or apparent to human beings. And so there are some people who want to remain strictly scientistic, not scientific, but scientistic in their viewpoint, that science alone gives us knowledge, and that we are nothing more than valuelessly, deterministically driven molecules in motion. That is all there is to humanity. But the broad naturalist says, no, there's something more to humanity. And so we need to broaden things. And so that is what is called the manifest image, what seems apparent to us or manifest to us, that humans are self-conscious, they're valuable, they're morally responsible, they have moral duties, they are purpose-seeking, and so forth. Now, the strict naturalist would say our belief that we have intrinsic value, our belief that consciousness exists, our belief or self-consciousness, our belief that purpose exists, and so forth, they would say that this is strictly an illusion, that these things appear to be so, but they are illusory. Of course, we can ask the question, as we'll see, why should we say that it's illusory? It may seem to be an illusion, but what if it really is the case? Then, how do we know the difference between what appears to be an illusion and what actually is an illusion? And science cannot determine that. Here's a question that John Searle asks. He's the late philosopher from Berkeley in California. He says there's one overriding question. The theist can answer this question very nicely, but the strict naturalist cannot. He says, how do we fit in? How can we square the self-conception of ourselves as mindful, meaning-creating, free, rational, etc. Beings with a universe that consists entirely of mindless, meaningless, unfree, non-rational, brute, physical particles? A very important question. But what is his answer to this? He says physical events have only physical explanations. And the consciousness is not physical, so consciousness plays no explanatory role whatsoever. If, for example, you think you ate because you were consciously hungry, or got married because you're consciously in love with your prospective spouse, or withdrew your hand from the flame because you consciously felt a pain, or spoke up at a meeting because you consciously disagreed with the main speaker, he says you are wrong in every case. In each case, the effect was a physical event and therefore must have an entirely physical explanation. So even if the things seem, there's that manifest image and then the scientific image, he's going with the scientific image, even though things seem like we have morality, that we have purpose, we have meaning, and so forth. He says, no, strict naturalism in a physical world cannot bring you to value and purpose and meaning and so forth. So this is, I would say that this is an utterly unnatural perspective to take. Why should we deny what seems so obvious to us? We call this the self-evidence problem. Why deny what seems so obvious to us? It seems that the burden of proof would be on the denier of what is obvious. And even if he says, yes, it appears that things have a purpose. It appears that, for example, biological organs, things seem to be designed, but they're not really designed. That's just, how do we know that something These are things that naturalism forces us to give up if we're going to be strict and consistent naturalists. So let me just say a few things about the contours now that we've looked at the various concepts, the tenets of naturalism and theism. Let me just I'm going to have to move very briefly here. What worldview landscape makes the best sense? And so we will talk about how theism makes better sense of the way things are than naturalism. So how do we, for example, how do we assess the value and rationality of naturalism as opposed to theism? How would we go about judging that? How would we determine that? Well, generally speaking, I think when we assess theories, we have three basic criteria, but we'll look at criteria first of all, and then the context. For what context makes the best sense of the way things are, naturalism or theism's context? So let me just go here and we'll talk about these criteria. How do we assess which worldview or theory to prefer, naturally or rationally? Here we'll get to the way to remember this is we're going to get to the nub of the issue. So when it comes to criteria, which worldview picture, first of all, is more natural, more unifying, and more basic? So which is, again, these are three areas that are a natural point of comparison. And so these offer us criteria for assessing what makes better sense. So what is more natural? Is naturalism more natural in terms of explanation than theism is? So what we mean by natural is that, what is the least surprising? What is the more to be expected outcome? What is the more natural transition from this background to this outcome? So that is something that we would, what can we be led to expect given naturalism or given theism? Should we expect consciousness? Should we expect free will? Should we expect beauty? Should we expect duties and intrinsic human dignity and so forth, things that we often take for granted, which lends itself to those outcomes, or even to the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the fact that there is a life-sustaining universe. And so how human value came about, he is a naturalist. He does maintain that valuelessness somehow produced human value, which of course is wishful thinking. For the theist, the finite value of human beings is not surprising if there is a supremely valuable human being. But for someone like Eric Wielenberg to say that value came out of valuelessness is quite a jump. It is not a natural transition. Secondly, what is more unifying? Which theory or worldview in question, naturalism or theism, brings together all of these diverse phenomena like the beginning and fine-tuning of the universe, consciousness, beauty, rationality, free will, human dignity, and so forth? This makes excellent, theism makes excellent sense of this. It is a unifier as opposed to these disparate things under naturalism, like the beginning of the universe. What does that have to do with consciousness? What does that have to do with rationality? What is, all of these, but if there's a personal God that exists, all of these things come together beautifully. And when it comes to Eric Wielenberg, he talks about these moral facts that exist. He talks, he's kind of like a Platonist, that these moral facts exist, as it were, almost anticipating the coming of human beings who would have the moral constitution to understand those moral facts. So it's like this huge cosmic accident that these moral facts are true, necessary facts, like 2 + 2 = 4. But yet human beings, contingent human beings, coming out of a mindless, deterministic universe, somehow achieve value such that they can understand those moral facts. So again, I can go into more detail on this, but let me just keep going here. So again, we've talked about the more natural, the more unifying, and then the more basic. Some naturalists will say, well, these things are just the case. These things are just there, and that's all. But is there a worldview that offers even a deeper explanation than another one? So here's a comparison where Bertrand Russell offered in a debate with Frederick Copleston. a Jesuit philosopher. When Copleston asked the atheist Bertrand Russell about the cause of the universe, Bertrand Russell said, "I should say that the universe is just there, and that's all." But we know that the universe began to exist a finite time ago. It hasn't always been there, and that's all. That it depends upon something, that there must be some independent cause that brought the universe into being. And we can talk about what the nature of that cause is, but clearly something always existed, but it wasn't the universe, because the universe is contingent, it's finite. The universe is winding down. The law of entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics, says that that energy is spreading out, that it is dissipating, and that therefore, if the universe is winding down, it suggests that the universe was at one point wound up, and that it can't be infinite, because all of the usable energy would be expended by now. So we've looked at the nub of the issue, which is more natural, more unifying, more basic. And then we can just look at the context, the broader context, which makes better sense of these features that we take for granted. And here's just a basic point of comparison. And I can't go into a lot of detail here, but we've seen that consciousness, beauty, free will, personhood, rationality, duties, and human value are hardly surprising if a good, personal, rational, creative, powerful, and wise God exists. But these outcomes are quite startling if everything is the product of deterministic, valueless, non-conscious, non-rational material processes. Theism leads us to expect these kinds of outcomes that we take for granted and live by every day, but not so if naturalism is the case. And so just very briefly, thirdly, I'll just offer a few examples of this. We'll look at various claims. What naturalists claim actually help affirm or reinforce belief in God. The Beatles sang this song in their album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, "I get by with little help from my friends." Well, in many ways, we as theists can maintain we get a little help from our friends who actually are naturalists, but yet affirm how theism offers a better explanation, and that naturalism often presents a dead end in terms of explanation. So how does this work? Well, we can, just as Psalm 19:1 says, the heavens are declaring the glory of God, we can say that the scientific naturalists are declaring the glory of God in a lot of their statements, that they actually reinforce theism. So how does this look? So what about the existence of the universe, or the beginning of the universe? Joseph Silk and John Barrow talk about this picture of, the beginning of the universe looks like the traditional picture of creation out of nothing. And they ask, what preceded the event called the Big Bang? The answer to our question is simple: nothing. Of course, this is ridiculous, because something can't produce, something can't be produced by nothing, non-being, no thing. This is a basic metaphysical question. Something had to exist in order for a finite universe to come to being. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. What is the cause of that? Well, something like God would make excellent sense of that, but to say that simply popped into existence uncaused out of nothing does not make any metaphysical sense. Being cannot be produced by non-being or no thing. William Rowe says that the emergence of the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe has given new weight to an argument for some sort of a creator. Michael Roos says, why is there anything at all? Not just the beginning of the universe, but why does anything exist? And this goes back to the question of Leibniz. Why does something exist rather than nothing at all? We can talk about consciousness, that various naturalistic philosophers say that consciousness is a mystery, one to which materialism signally fails to provide an answer. Naturalists recognize that there is no way to account for how consciousness can emerge from non-conscious matter. And I can go through a whole host of things. How could a series of physical events, little particles, blossom into this conscious experience? So we can talk about all sorts of things, free will and responsibility. Thomas Nagel says it's hard to give a naturalist. He's not a naturalist, but he does show that he's an atheist, though. But he says that it's hard not to conclude that we're helpless and not responsible for our actions. When it comes to rationality, people will say, like Noam Chomsky, the naturalist, basically, if he lands on the truth, it's just a lucky accident. It's not because he's more rational than the next person. But of course, determinists, or naturalists believe that they're more rational than the theists, but that makes no sense if we're just the products of these environmental and genetic forces over which we have no control. Every speech, thought, theory, poem, composition, and philosophy will turn out to be completely predictable in purely naturalistic terms. So we can say that that's true about what Richard Rorty just said, that everything that he says is not because he's rational, but because these forces over which he has no control have caused him to believe that and say that. Joel Marx says that objective moral values, he says that if God doesn't exist, there cannot be any such thing as right or wrong. The fundamentalists are correct. If without God, there is no morality. Hence, so he goes on to say, because he believes there is no God, then there can't be any morality. So he's trying to be consistent with this. So we can go on. We can talk about the presumed teleology, or the seeming design in the universe, or in biological organisms. How is everything so finely tuned? If things were just slightly tweaked, there would be no life possible. The universe and its laws, appear to have a design that is both tailor-made to support us, and if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. Even biological organisms, they seem to have, people will use analogies. Scientists will use analogies like computers and so forth to compare the genes to, that they look uncannily computer-like. Well, why couldn't this be design? Why does it just have to be the appearance of design? We can, and Timothy Lenoir talks about how design or purposive thinking has been steadfastly resisted in nearly every area of research. Biologists are hard pressed not to impute the language of design to living forms. And so Alvin Plantinga, a theist, talks about how such fine tuning is not surprising. If God exists, because God desires to communicate with intelligent life, and so theism makes greater sense than atheism or naturalism. Even beauty in the universe. Why is there so much beauty in the universe? Well, God's existence readily explains those things. Even human uniqueness, which sounds a lot like the image of God. We have the power, Richard Dawkins says, a naturalist, to defy the selfish genes of our birth. We alone on earth can rebel against these selfish replicators. And Daniel Dennett says much the same thing, another naturalist, the late Daniel Dennett. So again, all of these things, purpose, meaning, self-awareness, morality, duty, not to mention the beginning of the universe, these sorts of things are fundamental to our existence, and science cannot disprove these things. Science only asserts, but it can't disprove these things. And we're not opposed to science, but we're opposed to saying that science is the only way that we can come to know something. So let me just offer a few conclusions here. And again, we're at 9:15. So let me just offer a few quick comments, and then we'll take your questions. So we've gotten a taste of just how unnatural naturalism is, and how, by contrast, the existence of a good, powerful, intelligent, personal God makes excellent sense of a wide range of phenomena in the universe and in human experience. And although we don't have time to go into other questions, it is important for us to ask, if there is a God, has this God done anything to make himself more clearly known, to help us in the mess of our own humanity, the evil, the wickedness, the problems that we see in the world around us? Well, I maintain that God has done so in the person of Jesus Christ, who said, "The one who has seen me has seen God." John 14:9, "The one who has seen me has seen the Father." That Jesus' life, death, historical resurrection fulfill the deepest longings for humanity. Jesus came and said in John 10:10, "I've come that they might have life, and that they might have it in abundance." So we're looking for security, significance, identity. We all have a longing for that complete, perfect, eternal happiness that we will never experience in this life. Whatever our experiences are in this life, they fade over time, and that we can't have that enduring, perfect happiness that we all long for. And Jesus is, as the British writer C.S. Lewis said, myth became fact, that all of the world's great stories and philosophical insights and myths and so forth actually are embodied in this historical personage, Jesus of Nazareth, who made claims that no other human being made for himself. And he proved those claims by bodily rising from the dead. And that this signals hope for us, that because Jesus was raised, we too can be raised immortal to a new heavens and a new earth, in which every tear is wiped away from our eyes. So God gets his feet dirty, his hands bloody in this world in order to rescue us. That God is an involved God, not just some God who winds up the universe, and lets it go. But in this, talk, we've been able to only talk about some of these things about God's existence. That's what I was asked to speak on. But I did at least want to mention this important feature, that this is, in a sense, a natural next step to take. What is the nature of this God? Has this God revealed himself for us beyond the general into something more specific that gives to us concrete hope and the possibility of cosmic justice being done, of having that eternal, complete happiness that all of us long for in this life but can never achieve. So those are the sorts of things that I wanted to talk about. Thank you so much for taking the time with me. And so I'll stop sharing here, and then happy to take your questions now in the 15 minutes that remain.
Thank you, Dr. Copan, for your address. We have a very small period of time for questions, so we will take any questions that you have now. Anyone who'd like to
Very good.
ask something. So I'll begin with my question first, I guess. So Dr. Copan, okay, Aryan.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
All right. So, Dr. Copan, there is, as your contemporary, Dr. Craig has also argued multiple times that there is an uncanny sort of similarity between the mathematical structure in which the universe has come to be. And naturalism does not really, it would not be able to give a good answer for that. So could you please just talk to us more about that, how the world itself reveals in itself in a very structured, organized way, which naturalism would not be able to account for?
Yes, even the you see that the universe is so finely tuned that there are nearly, say, 50 parameters of the fine tuning of the universe, that if things were slightly altered when it comes to, say, the 4 physical forces of gravity or strong or weak nuclear force or or electromagnetism, if certain things were slightly altered mathematically by sometimes a millionth of a degree, life would be impossible. That you have, for example, if the rate of the expansion of the universe were slightly altered, life would be impossible. That you have the just even not to mention the big picture. Just that's some of the big picture, but even some things like the small pictures of, you look at the design of a sunflower or a nautilus shell, and you can see that there is a Fibonacci code embedded within, say, the structure of the sunflower or the nautilus shell. That basically a Fibonacci code is a structure that is based on the previous 2 numbers. So you add them together and you have, say, that kind of an expansion in that next sequence. So 1, you have 1 and then 2, and then you have 3, and then you take that previous number of 5, and then you have 5 and then 3 and so forth, and you have these sorts of things embedded in things like sunflowers or nautilus shells that reflect that kind of mathematical precision very beautifully. So those are just a couple of examples from the macro and the micro, but it is amazing. And Albert Einstein said that it was just remarkable that the universe is indeed comprehensible. And one of those ways in which it is comprehensible is that we can understand mathematical formulas and sequences that enable us to get people to the moon, that enable us to send spaceships into orbit and to take pictures that get to us to, in a sense, the edge of the universe, the Big Bang. And again, these sorts of things are just dramatic and amazing. But again, without that exquisite mathematical precision, these things would be impossible. And so that suggests a rational creator. This makes better sense than just these are our mathematically directed minds are accidental products of deterministic forces.
Aryan,
Yeah. Thank you for the lecture, Dr. Copan. I hope I'm audible.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yeah. So my question, I have 2 questions. Both of them are about the theism side of the presentation. So I I was also, when I was introduced to philosophy of religion, I read the introduction written to it by Beverly and Brian Clack. And over there, they make a point, which is a good point to me, that a lot of the literature in the discipline of philosophy of religion has a problem of sort of like, it is like a very Christian or a Protestant philosophy of religion, which, centers the Abrahamic religions. And like, for example, this is something I felt when you talked about the core tenets of theism, where the idea of the omnipotent, all-powerful God, omniscient, and so on, was there. And I just wanted to ask you about how do you reconcile different sorts of theisms there, because there are also, say, Buddhist ideas about this and so on. There are multiple different other world religions which are conflicting with the image and sort of core tenets of theism that Christian or Abrahamic theism might have. So, in the argument against naturalism, or rather in favor of theism, how are these different forms of theism reconciled and reckoned with?
Yes. These sorts of things, when we're comparing theism and naturalism, we can also do the same thing with theism and, say, various Eastern religions, whether it be, say, pantheistic or monistic versions of Hinduism, like the Advaita Vedanta school of Hinduism, or various forms of Buddhism. And Ninian Smart, who established the the particular field of religious studies, said that the difference between the traditional theistic religions, kind of Western, of course, they began in the East, but the the Western traditional religions of this biblical theism, for example, they have a different understanding of the ultimate reality than most Eastern perspectives. The Eastern perspective maintains a more impersonal ultimate reality, or in classical Buddhism, no ultimate reality at all. But yet, here's a problem. Why should we maintain the inescapability of moral virtues like compassion, kindness, and so forth that Buddhists themselves will espouse? Part of their eightfold path and so forth. Why would you espouse these sorts of things when your ultimate reality is not personal at all? So theism is better placed to affirm personal virtues like compassion, kindness, love, and so forth than non-Western religions that don't have a personal ultimate reality. We can also say the same thing when it comes to issues related to the beginning of the universe or the existence of something that has always been. Buddhism, for example, maintains that there is nothing permanent that exists. Everything is transitory. It's the doctrine of impermanence, which is itself a permanent doctrine in Buddhism. But basically, it's sort of like what Heraclitus, the philosopher, said, that you can't step into the same river twice, and that there is no such thing as the soul that endures. The soul is like this enduring, it is just this stream of consciousness. And there can be, as for example, the Dalai Lama in Tibetan Buddhism says, there is no creator that exists. Buddhism is based on that philosophy, but Christians disagree with that, and they base their philosophy on the fact that there is a personal creator. But it's interesting that someone like a Paul Williams, who was himself a Buddhist and taught Eastern philosophy at the University of Bristol in the UK, he became a Christian because he realized that Buddhism could not answer the question of why is there something rather than nothing at all? What grounds our very existence? So he abandoned Buddhism in favor of theism and Christian theism, because Christian theism actually addressed that very deep gap within Buddhism as he had come to see it. So those are just a couple of examples of how we can address some of those concerns from a particular theistic biblical theism point of view. And the question is not why, how do you deal with other issues, other worldviews? The question more fundamentally boils down to, well, which worldview actually makes the best sense of all of these phenomena that we take for granted? Some worldviews deny the reality of evil, but Christian theists believe that evil is a key problem that cannot be written off as an illusion, but that one that God takes very seriously. And that's why Jesus Christ came into the world to destroy the works of the devil. He came to address the problem of evil rather than just calling it an illusion or saying it doesn't exist. As naturalists say, evil, it doesn't exist. Or, the Advaita Vedanta school of Hinduism says evil is just an illusion. I'd say that's deeply problematic and counterintuitive. So those are just a few examples.
All right. Thank you for that response. If I can follow up, but then I just was wondering that, these things such as problems of evil or say the problem of suffering, wouldn't that then be better answered by Buddhism, say, because Buddha famously has a silence in regards to these metaphysical questions. It's not a rejection of them or an affirmation or even an I don't know, but a silence because, these questions are taken as not relevant to the everyday human reality and suffering, which Buddhism as a practice and as a religion seeks to address. So,
Right.
yeah, in that regard, I was wondering about how then exactly is Buddhism not being able to talk about the why is there something other than nothing thing an issue, because that's only an issue if you give importance to that question, which Buddhism quite explicitly takes away from it.
Thank you. Good question. I think this will have to be the last one. I need to leave fairly soon. But I wasn't saying that Buddhism denied evil in suffering. Buddhism actually began with that quest to understand suffering and to make sense of it and how to live in light of suffering. And of course, part of the problem is, the matter of desire or craving, that we crave things, we cling to them, and those things let us down, those things disappoint us. And I would say that the Buddhist is right in certain things, that we do cling to things that are temporary, things that pass away, things that cannot ultimately resolve the problem of suffering. But I'd say Buddhism, because of its view of how everything is transitory and how even the individual self cannot exist, the individual self is just a bundle of properties that is constantly changing. How do we make sense of the continuity of personhood because Buddhism fundamentally denies that? So what happened to me 10 years ago, that person didn't exist. Whatever was experiencing, whatever entity was experiencing things back then is completely different. And why should I fear the future or even do things for my own future when I won't even exist in the future, because everything is constantly changing. Even from a physical point of view, my cells change my body change every 7 years. So I'm going to be completely different physically every 7 years. So the same thing goes for, if you're again, anatman, the denial of the self that Buddhism espouses. I find that a very difficult problem that Buddhism has. Furthermore, Buddhism, which denies the creator, I'd say you have a very real basis for affirming distinct personhood and the value of every human being who's been made in the image of God. For the Buddhists, the Buddha simply just asserts that, saying, that we have value, and that the bodhisattva comes to rescue, after in postponing nirvana, coming back to help people also achieve nirvana. Where does the value come from if everything is changing? What stable ground is there for value? And of course, I mentioned the question of Paul Williams, the former Buddhist, who recognized that there needs to be some sort of stable ground to on which we can judge something to change. You see, there's a basic metaphysical principle that says that change presupposes sameness. How do we know that things are changing unless you have a stable ground to judge things that are changing from this to that. And I'd say that there are some deep considerations here that I think serve as a gentle challenge to Buddhism. Yes, Buddhism is to be credited for taking suffering seriously, but I don't think the equipment that it has to address the problem is really the issue. And for the Christian, the problem is not desire or craving. We ought to crave God. We ought to desire God. We ought to long to be in communion with God, who is that stabilizing force. So the problem is not desire itself, but it is wrong desire from the Christian tradition. But for the Buddhist, it is all desire. And I think that this is problematic. And how can we even desire to have our desire extinguished? There's yet, I think, a further problem in my own understanding of Buddhism. If we're desiring, kind of the ultimate, maybe this extinction of our own selves, that seems to be rooted in desire itself. So there are a number of reasons I could give, but maybe that will help to address at least some of the questions that you've raised. But I thank you for your time, everyone. It's been marvelous to be with you overseas through this mechanism of a virtual lecture, but very glad to be with you. Thank you for your questions. Thanks for your attention. And as I said, I'll pass on to Brian my PowerPoint in PDF form so that you can have access to it. And again, if you want to drop me a note through my website, paulcopan.com, you're welcome to do that. I'll do the best that I can to keep up with you. But thank you so much for the attention that you've given to me. And Brian, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your Philosophical Society discussion today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in. It's been
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Copan, for taking all the time. This was the last lecture of the academic present council. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best to you. Bye.